All right, that's a good start.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting my slides backwards for a moment. There we go. Is that okay? How's that working?
Yes, it is working.
All right. All right then. Thank you very much, Martin, for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to everybody for turning up. I am delighted to be here. I have never been to Slovenia in person, though actually I did take a train through it when it was still part of Yugoslavia. But I'm delighted that I can give this talk hosted in Slovenia. It's always a great pleasure to speak in a new forum. So I'm just going to give a reasonably introductory talk because I know that there may be many people in the audience who are not familiar with this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that I view the problem of aging and the nature of aging and how that leads to a particular philosophy for doing something about it and keeping people healthy as they get older. And then I'll talk a bit about how much progress we are making, both in terms of my own organization, SENS Research Foundation, and also the other entities, the other companies and organizations around the world that have joined forces with us and are contributing to the crusade. And of course, I will talk about how this fits with the current state of the world, in particular the pandemic, because I believe that there are enormous opportunities and priorities that we all need to be aware of if we want to make the most of this. So we all know that over the past maybe 150, 200 years, there has been a great deal of progress in terms of keeping people living longer on average. Here is one way to illustrate that trajectory. This is statistics from the USA, projected out to 2050, and it simply describes the proportion of the US population that are over the age of 65. And of course, this is more or less the same story in every industrialized country. You can also ask questions like, what is the actual life expectancy? And again, you get the same kind of scenario. Now, as we all know, the reason why this has happened is mainly because of the virtual elimination of death early in life. Infant mortality, mortality in childbirth, and so on. And of course, that was really high a long time ago. In fact, even in the wealthiest countries in the world, there were something like 40% of deaths in infancy. In other words, 40% of babies would die before the age of 1. That's just an insane number. And of course, now it's almost 0. So that's great. That's an enormous success. But of course, what it has delivered is a population, a large proportion of whom live long enough to suffer from aspects of ill health which are not based on infection. Things like, hello, this isn't working yet. There we go. Things like this, result in this. The thing about the health problems of late life that really distinguishes them in terms of society most sharply from the things that used to kill so many people early in life is that the things in late life kill you slowly. They are chronic progressive conditions that make you just a little bit sick and then a bit more sick and then a bit more sick and eventually they kill you. But that means that they are incredibly expensive. So again, here I'm showing statistics from the USA. The red line is the trajectory over a period of just 50 years, from 1960 through to 2010, of the US economy, how the US economy grew during that period. And the blue line is the growth in medical expenditure, again in the USA, during that same period. That doesn't look too scary, but it's terrifying when you divide one by the other, and that's the green line, the proportion of the US economy that is spent on medical care. In just 50 years, it went up from 5% up to 18%. Enormous. And that's, of course, why everybody's saying that Social Security in various countries is going to go bankrupt soon and so on. So we'd really like to do something about this, quite apart from the fact that we'd like to stop people from getting sick when they get old. So what's the problem? Well, I believe that a huge part of the problem is what I'm showing you here, that the way in which people think about aging is broken. People have a distorted definition of aging in their heads. In particular, they think that aging is nothing like the things they think of as diseases. If you ask people, in what ways can somebody get sick? They will say, well, there's infections, that's column 1 in this table. Then there's inherited diseases, that's column 2. There are things that a very small number of people get as a result of being given it by their parents. And then there's the big one, the chronic progressive diseases of late life, like Alzheimer's and almost all cancers and atherosclerosis and so on. And then there's this rather poorly defined thing that's way out in the stratosphere called aging itself, which consists of these things like frailty, you know, that people haven't really got a firm definition of in their mind. And that's a huge problem, partly because it's fuzzy and imprecise, but mainly because it's wrong. And I'm going to explain why it's wrong. This is actually what aging is. Aging is simply the combination of two processes, a lifelong process of the accumulation of damage in the body that is created as a consequence of the body's normal operation, in other words, our metabolism, and then late in life, the progression of sicknesses, of aspects of ill health arising from having more damage than what the body is set up to tolerate. The reason why that right-hand process only kicks off late in life is because the body is set up to tolerate quite a lot of these molecular and cellular changes that are caused by metabolism, but not, of course, an infinite amount. And what that leads to is a modification of the table that I showed you a moment ago. This is the way. Hello. My computer is misbehaving and not changing the slides, but I'll get there. There we go. Yeah, so this changes, it's caused a modification of my slides. Here it is. All of the columns here are the same as what I showed you in the previous version of this table a couple of slides ago. But I've drawn that big, thick black line in a different place. And that is a really important difference. Because first of all, it emphasizes that the things in column 3, which are the focus of so much medical research and medical effort today, are nothing like the things in column 1. They are not like infections at all. Really, I think they should not be called diseases. Instead, they should be called part of aging, because that's the other thing that moving the black line gives you. It shows you that really there's no difference, no clear difference between column 3 and column 4. It's just terminology. The things in column 3 are the aspects of aging that we are choosing to give disease-like names to. That's all, which is not much of a difference, really. So we shouldn't be thinking about it in the same way. Now, that's actually really helpful in helping us to see how we can go about doing something about aging. Because if we now look at what people are currently trying to do about aging, we see that it's really not working. And my slides are being very slow to, there we go. What we're doing is this. We are attacking the pathologies of late life as if they were infections. We are trying to eliminate them from the body, even though the thing that causes them, this damage, is still accumulating. So obviously that's not going to work. You know, it's just crazy that we should even be trying to do that. This is what we see when we do try to do it. We see that there's just too many things to try to fix. Here we have, you know, hundreds of different things that go wrong with us late in life. And they go wrong at more or less the same time, and they interact with each other. You know, it's hopeless. Now, some people worked that out a long time ago. More than a century ago, in fact, a few people started to realize that we would never be able to attack all of these pathologies one at a time. Instead, we should be more preventative. And the idea that they had was that we should try to make metabolism run more cleanly. We should somehow slow down the rate at which metabolism generates damage. And people were quite hopeful because they saw that maybe we could do that by copying other species. We, of course, live a long time already, but maybe we don't have all the tricks that other species have for making damage accumulate more slowly. But maybe we could somehow copy other species. But that has not worked either. This is basically why it hasn't worked. We have so little understanding of how our metabolism even functions. And furthermore, even if we did understand it, you know, look at it. This is like the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code. There is just no way we're going to be able to tweak this network in such a way to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, creating damage, without at the same time stopping it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. It's just not going to happen. But luckily, that's not the end of the story. There is a third option. I call it really the common sense option. Instead of trying to slow down the left-hand process where metabolism generates damage, or indeed slow down the right-hand process where damage generates pathologies, which is what other people have been trying to do, instead, we can just separate those two processes from each other. That's the damage repair approach. I'm calling it here the maintenance approach. Damage repair is simply let metabolism do its normal thing, create damage at the normal rate, but then periodically remove some of the damage, eliminate it from the body so that it does not reach that point which is more than what the body can tolerate. If it doesn't reach that point, then the right-hand process will never kick off, and we just won't get the pathologies of late life at all. So effectively, we are sidestepping all of that complexity, all of our ignorance about how the process of aging really works. And that is a really big step forward. The reason I call it the common sense approach is because it's what we already do successfully with simple man-made machines like cars. This car here is, of course, more than 100 years old, and it's working just as well as when it was built. But wait, it was not designed to last 100 years. It was designed to last maybe 10 or 15 years before the damage that it was accumulating as a consequence of its normal function would reach the point of causing bad things to happen, like the doors falling off or whatever. But its owners have looked after it. They have periodically eliminated that damage, the rust or whatever, and sure enough, the car is working every bit as well as the day it was built. So how does that really work for the human body? Well, nearly 20 years ago now, I presented this classification of the various types of damage that you can see on the left of this table, types of damage that we need to eliminate from the body in order to actually implement this maintenance approach. And as you can see, they are simple to state. They are broad categories, but they are still, you know, concrete, well-defined biological phenomena. So, for example, cell loss. That's simply when cells die and they are not automatically replaced by the division of other cells. And that, of course, is tolerable for a while, but eventually you end up with too few cells of the relevant type. And that means that the organ that is affected doesn't work properly. Parkinson's disease is a fine example of an aspect of aging that is caused by that, because it's a particular part of the brain in which brain cells in neurons die much more rapidly than they do in most parts of the brain, and they make an important chemical called dopamine, and if you don't have enough dopamine, you have Parkinson's. Now, the way to fix that is something you already know about, namely just put the cells back using stem cell therapy. If we can do that, if we can put replacements in, instead of, to compensate for the fact that the body is not replacing these cells on its own by cell division, then we achieve the same results. And sure enough, clinical trials are already in progress right now to do exactly that, to put new dopaminergic neurons, as they're called, the cells that make dopamine, back into the right part of the brain so that they will actually compensate for the cell loss that's happening throughout life. The same general idea holds for all of the other types of damage that I've listed here. The reason we set up SENS Research Foundation was because even though stem cell therapy was already going really well in the research labs around the world, and of course is now in clinical trials for a variety of different applications, nevertheless, these other types of damage also need to be repaired, and the work to do that was at a much earlier stage. And I'm very proud to say that we were able to not only define this, but make a lot of progress. First of all, eventually, after a decade or so, the scientific community came around to the idea that this is actually a very promising approach. So I'm showing you here some diagrams from a paper that came out 7 years ago. This paper essentially restates the concept of divide and conquer damage repair, and it was by far the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging in the past decade. So this is definitely a mainstream idea now. I don't have to persuade scientists anymore that this makes sense. Also, there's been actual progress in the laboratory. So here is a small selection of the advances that we've made in SENS Research Foundation. I list these particular papers that we published because they were extremely important breakthroughs, areas where progress had completely stagnated for more than a decade, and we were able to get things going again by doing the really difficult initial work that showed that the concept could actually succeed. And now all of these areas have moved forward very effectively. In fact, they have moved forward so far that we no longer have to do them in the foundation. Not most of them anyway. A few of them we do, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But most of them we've been able to spin out as startup companies. So this is a list of some of the companies that we've created as offshoots from the foundation that have taken the intellectual property and the projects that we pursued for many years beforehand, and now they are funded by investment rather than by philanthropy, which of course means that they have a lot more money than they had before, and they are moving faster as the result. So that's a really important piece of progress that we're very proud of. Of course, it's not just us. Here is a very, very incomplete list of the companies that have sprung up independently of us, but doing closely aligned work that is also in the theme of damage repair, and which have also been able to bring in plenty of money. Let me just highlight the third one on the list, Unity Biotechnology. They raised a very large amount of money, $300 million, at a very early stage before they'd even begun their first clinical trial. And that clinical trial was very successful. That was last year. And, that's really good news. And of course, they're moving on from there. So this is really good news. And I draw your attention to the website at the bottom right, which was set up by one of the more active investors in this field, Carl Flager, so as to help other investors to identify opportunities. I used to be able to do this in my head. I used to be able to just feel that I had a pretty comprehensive command of who was working in this field and what they were doing, but I'm completely underwater now. There's no way that I can really keep up properly. So that's an extremely important resource. Now, I do want to emphasize, however, that that's not the whole story. I'm having trouble. Here we go. because, as I say, there are some projects within the foundation which have not yet reached the point where they are investable. We tend to spin projects out as startups when they are within a couple of years of going into clinical trial. And 4 or 5 years ago, well, 4 years ago, we made an estimate for how soon each of our projects would go into clinical trial. And we came to the conclusion that most of them had a good chance of getting there within 5 years. So that's now within only 1 year. Luckily, I'm pleased to say that we have not really had to revise this estimate. Even though things have been difficult, nevertheless, the projects that looked as though they could be in clinical trials by this year or next year, still they look as though they're going to be there. Those are the ones that have already been spun out. But I have to tell you that there are still a few projects which are at an earlier stage. They may be still a year or two from becoming companies, and maybe 3 or 4 years from actual clinical trial, which means that we still do desperately need more donations, more financial support for the non-profit SENS Research Foundation so as to move this forward. I should emphasize that it's possible to donate to SENS Research Foundation if you are a European taxpayer, even though we are a US charity. We have a UK-based affiliates charity and arrangements with other countries within Europe so that one can make tax-efficient donations to SENS Research Foundation, even if one is a European citizen. Finally, I just want to say, I want to talk about longevity, because, of course, when we talk to the general public about this work, the conversation does not generally revolve around how good it would be not to get sick as we get old. Most of it revolves around the side effect that we would actually live a lot longer. The fact is, yes, it's true. Since most people these days in the industrialized world die of aging, if we stop people from getting sick when they get old, if we essentially eliminate aging, then on average, it's likely that people will live longer. In fact, they may live a lot longer, because the fact is, we will continue to improve these therapies, and we will also continue to reduce the risks of death from causes that do not have to do with how long ago you were born, like road accidents, or indeed pandemics, and I'll come to that in a moment. Furthermore, this is going to happen very soon. It may be 15 or 20 years from now before these therapies are really all working fully and in combination so that we can actually achieve this. But people are going to know within, I would say, the next 3 or 5 years that it's definitely coming. And that is going to alter the way people spend money on things like life insurance and pensions and inheritance. So we'd better be ready for this. I believe that especially the financial services sector, but really everybody, needs to anticipate that transition to a world in which people expect to live a lot longer, because that's going to happen a very great deal sooner than people actually living a lot longer. That's a really important thing to bear in mind. But now let me come to the pandemic, because as we all know, the pandemic is very disproportionately affecting the elderly. The elderly are more vulnerable than young adults to all infection. And certainly every year, a lot of elderly people die from influenza. But I'm sure you all know that COVID-19 has a much greater disparity in that regard than seasonal flu, that almost all of the deaths that are occurring are happening to people over the age of 65 or 70. And the ones that are happening younger are the rare people with severe pre-existing conditions that resemble the conditions that so many of the elderly have. So yeah, this is, a big deal. But here's the thing that I regard as a piece of good news. People have been really compliant with the lockdown. People have just done what they were told. And that's despite the fact that it's essentially only people in their declining years that are being affected. So this tells us that the political calculation that politicians are making all the time about what's going to get them votes and what's not going to get them votes is different from what they may have thought it was before. They can now see that spending taxpayers' money on helping the elderly to stay healthy is not going to lose them votes. It's going to be essentially the same thing as implementing a lockdown. People are going to say that it's the right thing to do. So that means that we have an opportunity here, we in the longevity community. The opportunity that we have is to influence policymakers around the world to actually take this into account and to allocate considerably more money than there have been to keeping the elderly healthy, especially, of course, to keeping the elderly robust in terms of their immune system. And certainly a large part of our work and the work going on in this community revolves around rejuvenating the immune system. That work has shown a lot of promise, but it could be going a lot faster if it were better funded. There are, of course, plenty of things to be done that are not at the level of basic research, simply allocating more money to infrastructure, personnel, and so on, so as to be able to respond much more rapidly when the next pandemic happens in terms of generating and testing vaccines to keep it under control. I'm quite certain that the time from an infection appearing to a vaccine being widely available could be reduced by a factor of 2 or 3 or perhaps even more, simply by appropriately preparing for it, by making that investment. But the final thing I want to emphasize is that it goes beyond the immune system. Because of the misconception that I mentioned earlier about the definition of aging, a lot of people are very inclined to think of aging as a bunch of relatively separate phenomena. There's aging of the immune system, there's aging of the reproductive system, and so on. And it's vital, therefore, to educate everybody, but especially policymakers and opinion formers, on the fact that in aging, there is a huge amount of crosstalk. Everything talks to everything else. And we are simply not going to be able to rejuvenate the immune system all that effectively unless we rejuvenate every system and do the entire job of putting the body back into the state at the molecular and cellular level that it was in at an earlier age. If we can do that, then we've got a real chance of leveraging the pandemic and creating an enormous silver lining. In other words, actually accelerating the crusade to keep people truly healthy late in life, relative to how it was before. However, I just want to end with this enormously important point. We only have a short window of opportunity to influence decision makers and policy makers around the world. Right now, they're not listening to us. They're not listening to anybody, really, except for people who are focused on the immediate term. They need to get this pandemic under control, and that's how it ought to be. And then eventually, they're going to start thinking about how to prepare for next time, how to minimize the impact of such events. And eventually, they're going to come to a decision. In fact, quite quickly, they're going to come to a decision about what their priorities ought to be. Once they have made that decision, our opportunity will be gone. So we have absolutely to get in there and lobby politicians, policymakers, decision makers, opinion formers before their idea of what their priorities ought to be ends up becoming fixed in the wrong way. You know, let's remember, we don't work on longevity, we work on health. Longevity is a side effect. The media provide an enormous distraction here, but it's still true. We shouldn't be worrying about these things, which are the main things that policymakers have historically thought on the left here when we talk about eliminating aging. We should be thinking about health. As I've said, the pandemic gives us a chance here. It has concentrated the minds of the people who matter, the policymakers and decision makers around the world, on the importance of the health of the elderly. So let's do this. If you want to know more about the biology of all of this, well, go and have a look at this book that I wrote some time ago. It's been translated into quite a few languages now. And of course, there's also our website, which has an enormous amount of information on what we do and what other people are doing. And you can even write to us there. And of course, you can also donate to the foundation at that point. So I hope I've left a few minutes for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aubrey de Grey. It was a great talk and inspiring things, and also great ideas. When I was listening, I just got the idea about news event in Slovenia, event about how to prevent new epidemic, and on the topic, we would put the topic life extension in this event. So, but I think that also audience will be happy to have some questions. Maybe now they're so full of so full head of everything that it's hard to write in the moment. But we have already first question from Didier. So he says, what is your explanation about the fact that despite enormous amount of money against COVID, we do not yet have new antivirus antibodies drugs working?
I think it's really simple. I think the only reason why we don't have it is because we were not ready. There are enormously many things that go together to generate a new medical treatment for anything. And the process requires personnel and infrastructure to be in place beforehand. I have been saying, and many other people have been saying for a very long time, that it's a complete scandal how little effort has gone into the development of new antibiotics, which of course is not relevant to viral infections, but it's certainly relevant to bacterial infections. There's an enormous amount of research out there on ways to get new antibiotics, and hardly any money goes into it. It's insane. Now, I think people can see how enormously problematic it is to when a virus gets out of control, when a virus has the high infection rate and of course the long latency after infection that allows it to be transmitted without us knowing it's being transmitted. Now that people see the problem that's caused by that, they will see that it makes sense to invest much more money in all of that preparatory infrastructure. But that didn't happen until now. I see someone just mentioned SARS, and of course, yes, there's been plenty of other warning signs. We've dodged a few bullets over the past couple of decades, SARS, MERS, avian flu. But the reason we dodged them was because those infections did not spread the way this one did. This one has. They didn't have the latency time in particular. So it was much, much easier to bring them under control before they became a bona fide global pandemic. This one we didn't have that piece of luck. And now people can see how crazy it was not to develop that infrastructure. We will do it this time. So I don't think we have much danger of the current problem happening again, of taking 18 months or whatever to develop and distribute a new vaccine. But as I said, that is not the whole problem.
Thank you. Maybe I would have one more question. In this conference, we were also talking about the question how to present people that they will all benefit from these new technologies. That one thing that this is just for elite. What would be your answer to that?
Okay, that's a really easy question to answer. We know for a fact that as soon as these technologies come along, it will make economic sense to make them available to everybody. In fact, it will be economically suicidal not to, because they will pay for themselves so fast in terms of saving us all the money that we spend today on keeping sick people alive. That's a really ironclad argument. And it makes sense even in countries like the USA that really don't like taxation. I do want to come back to the previous question, though, because someone has written a very important point here. David Wood mentioned that big companies don't prioritize vaccine development, and it's true, of course. The same applies to antibiotics, which I mentioned. But the point is, governments have a control over that. Governments are perfectly capable of subsidizing big companies and making it commercially attractive to do these things. It's just that until now, they have not seen that that makes any economic sense from the government's point of view. Now, of course, that calculation will come out very differently, and I certainly expect that we will see companies incentivized financially to do what they should have been incentivized to do all along.
Okay, and maybe the last question from Micha Amon. How big of the problem are, in your opinion, the epigenetic changes or a loss of epigenetic information in tissues?
This is still a very big open question. Certainly there are a lot of epigenetic changes that happen. The ones that are easiest to detect are probably not the ones that actually matter, because they only happen because they don't matter. In other words, because evolution has not taken the trouble to stop them from happening. However, the epigenetic changes that we do see that are perhaps less easy to detect still need to be paid attention to. In general, they may be adaptive. In other words, they may exist to minimize the effect of non-genetic and non-epigenetic changes that are happening anyway, like the accumulation of waste products. And for that reason, we would actually not want to alter them. That would just do more harm than good. But there's a lot more to it than that. And this is a huge research area that I believe we certainly need to understand more about.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. We are honored to your present. Okay, I don't know how much I can take additional time or not.
Well, let me just say, I know there will be a lot of other questions, and I think lots of questions coming up in the chat. Since we don't have time to do them now, I just encourage people to write to me on the SENS website. There's a contact form there. We're very good at answering the questions that come in there. So, that's the way to ask more questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Aubrey de Grey, and we wish you great research in the future, in the near future and in the far future. So, and hopefully we see more, and you are always welcome to Slovenia.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, and thanks for congratulations on an excellent conference.
Thank you. Goodbye.